Good morning. I'm Harley Schlanger from the LaRouche Organization with your daily video update for February 8th, 2023. I want to begin with a personal statement. As I was poring through documents and reading in preparation for this update, I was afraid I wouldn't be able to make it through without exploding into rage over the absolute evil that is represented by the US government and the European Union governments in response to the tragedy of the earthquake and earthquakes which have hit Turkey and Syria, especially the refusal of the US to lift the sanctions against Syria, where people are left freezing and without help because of the destruction of the civil war and the continued sanctions from the United States. This is an extraordinarily evil policy. And you can say, yes, that's the Biden administration, and it is. The Biden administration is doing this, but it's in continuation of a policy that goes back to Bill Clinton, the George W. Bush Cheney administration, the Obama administration, and also, yes, Donald Trump, who imposed sanctions on Syria and did not take away the U.S. policy of blaming Syria for the terror that the U.S. was supporting in arming and training ISIS and Al Qaeda. So it's been a continuous thread, and children are dying of cold and hunger, not just in Syria from the earthquake, but in Afghanistan, in Yemen, as the U.S. continues to inflict suffering on innocent children for policies that can only be described as defending the empire, the financial empire of the Anglo-Americans. So to call it the deep state or the swamp understates the evil. And I want to start with the sanctions imposed on Iraq by President Clinton, which the United Nations confirmed killed nearly 600,000 Iraqi children in the 1990s from the effects of sanctions. Madeleine Albright was the Secretary of State under Clinton, and she was asked in a May 1996 interview by Lesley Stahl on 60 Minutes about the more than 500,000 children that died in Iraq from the sanctions. And Lesley Stahl said, 500,000 died. Is the price worth it? And Albright said on the sanctions that were imposed that killed so many that it is, quote, a very hard choice, but the price, we think, the price is worth it, unquote. That from the Secretary of State of the United States, 500,000 or more deaths, almost 600,000 deaths, were worth it for the eventual removal of Saddam Hussein. Now, Albright, who was the Secretary of State under Clinton from 1997 to 2001, was an ardent supporter of Hillary Clinton for president. And she made the following statement, quote, there's a special place in hell for women who don't help each other, insisting that people support Clinton. I think Albright is now living in that special place in hell for what she did and her defense of that. She was a National Security Council staffer under Zbigniew Brzezinski, and continued the outlook of Brzezinski, which was that the U.S. had a responsibility to destroy the Soviet Union and to impose its military force everywhere in the world. She was the ambassador to the United Nations from 1993 to 1997 before she became Secretary of State. And she's a mentor to many of the people who now are making policy under Biden. For example, U.S. Secretary of State Tony Blinken described her as a, quote, role model for him, and, quote, for many of our diplomats, unquote. He described her as his mentor and, quote, a brilliant diplomat. Also, you have in this crew of murderers in the State Department, a Rhodes Scholar, Jake Sullivan, who's not in the State Department, he's a National Security Council. Ned Price, who's a spokesman for the State Department. These are people with ambition greater than their intellect and greed, which leaves no room for compassion. Now, on the present policy of keeping sanctions on Syria in the wake of this earthquake, which has caused so much damage and suffering. Here's what Ned Price said. He said, quote, "I will make the point that it would be quite ironic, if not even counterproductive, for us to reach out to a government that has brutalized its people over the course of a dozen years now, gassing them, slaughtering them, being responsible for much of the suffering that they have endured," unquote. This is outright lying. The suffering in Syria comes from the support from the West of the uprising against the Assad government. It comes from the arming and training of ISIS and Al Qaeda and the unleashing of them against the Syrian people and opposing the government of Assad. In fact, calling for regime change. And the civil war inflicted enormous damage on that country. And instead of lifting the sanctions and helping to rebuild, the sanctions continue in place even now as children are shivering in the freezing cold with no homes, no blankets, in many cases not knowing where their parents or siblings are. This is the policy of the U.S. State Department. Now, Colonel Richard Black, who is a former Marine and the former head of the U.S. Army Criminal Division at the Pentagon, issued a statement in response to this. And here's what Colonel Black said, and I think this reflects the actual thinking of many Americans and others in the world who are not part of this evil cabal. He said, "I've got to tell you, I've never seen such a barbaric response to a tragedy where you literally have people in Aleppo City who are looking at piles of concrete, their lives coming to an end, they're freezing in the cold, they're there without food, without water, and they're dying. Meanwhile, the State Department takes the opportunity to re-emphasize the fact that we are bitter because we could not impose our will on the Syrian people," unquote, referring to forcing regime change in Syria. He said, he goes on to say, "It was in 2020 that the U.S. imposed the Syria sanctions out of anger at the fact that Syria had driven back the ISIS and Al Qaeda terrorists that the U.S. had supported. Now the State Department looks at this as an opportunity to simply ratchet up the regime of starvation and freezing that we have imposed on Syria through the cruel Caesar sanctions." And Black concluded the statement by saying, "I am quite disgusted by the actions of the U.S. State Department. It is really unbecoming of any civilized nation that they would choose this moment to take out their vengeance on the poor, suffering people of Syria." And as I said, I think Colonel Black speaks for many of us when we look at what is being done in our name. And it's, as I said, it's not just the Syria situation, which is heightened by the tragedy of the earthquake, but we still have sanctions that are freezing children in Afghanistan, in Yemen. And the U.S. policy, the NATO policy of continued war against Russia, refusing to allow the Ukrainian government to negotiate a ceasefire and a peace, is leading to misery of many, many of the children in Ukraine that we supposedly are defending and protecting. That's the nature of the U.S. policy right now. Now, the same Ned Price who made his statement about how ironic it would be if we helped Syria now, had the following to say about the U.S. policy toward China in the wake of the farce of the space balloon that has so many in Washington in a tizzy. Price said the State Department is organizing, quote, "a coalition of like-minded countries to work in lockstep to confront China." Now, he said this is the same coalition which the Biden administration has organized against Russia, which has brought us to the brink of nuclear war. At what point will the American people say enough? What about the people of France, of Germany? We're seeing mobilizations in France, 3 million people in the streets. Denmark, 50 to 60,000 people in the streets. Well, the Americans will have a chance to express their concern with these demented policies of our permanent bureaucracy, typified by likes of Albright, Blinken, Bush and Cheney. On February 19th, there will be a march in Washington, D.C., a rage against the war machine. I don't care if you're a Republican, a Democrat, a Libertarian, an Independent, doesn't matter. If you're a human being, you need to support this demonstration. Either go there or send money, but be a part of it. The future depends on the American people and the people in the Anglo-American sphere, which includes NATO and the European Union, speaking out and acting as human beings instead of robotic automatons like the cold-blooded people, Ned Price, Blinken, Biden, the Bush team, and so on. The future of humanity depends on your action now.